The glass doors of Whitmore Financial Group's downtown headquarters reflected the gray November sky as Thomas Johnson pushed his cleaning cart toward the building's side entrance. It was 11:47 a.m. when he noticed the man sitting on the cold concrete steps, hunched over with his shoulders trembling. The stranger's coat, though clearly expensive once, was now torn at the shoulder, and his salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the exhaustion etched across his face. Thomas had seen this look before in the mirror during his own darkest days, years ago when he'd lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. Inside the lobby, Elena Rodriguez glanced up from the reception desk just as Thomas was heading back out with his brown paper bag. She watched curious as the janitor sat down next to the homeless man on those cold steps. Through the glass she could see Thomas opening his lunch, the modest sandwich and apple his daughter had packed for him that morning, and offering half to the stranger. The man's hands shook as he accepted the food. They sat together for 20 minutes, two men sharing a meal in silence, while corporate employees in tailored suits walked past them without a second glance. Tom Bradshaw, the building's facilities supervisor, spotted the scene from his second-floor office window. His jaw tightened with disapproval. Thomas Johnson was already on thin ice after last month's incident when he'd been late 3 times because his son had been hospitalized. Bradshaw had made it clear then, one more strike, and Thomas would be looking for work elsewhere. And now, here he was, wasting company time fraternizing with vagrants on company property. Bradshaw made a mental note to address this in their next meeting. What nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly known as they watched that simple act of kindness unfold on those concrete steps, was that the homeless man accepting half of Thomas Johnson's modest lunch was Robert Whitmore himself, the founder's grandson and the company's largest shareholder, who had disappeared 3 months ago after a very public and very bitter dispute with the board of directors. The following morning, Thomas arrived at 5:30 a.m. as always, before the sun had fully risen over the Chicago skyline. The building was still quiet, save for the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of early morning traffic. He began his rounds on the executive floor, emptying trash bins and vacuuming the plush carpets of offices that cost more per square foot than his entire monthly rent. He moved through these spaces like a ghost, invisible to the people who would occupy them in a few hours, people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever knowing the names of those who cleaned up after them. By 8 a.m., the building had come alive. Elevators dinged constantly, phones rang, and the air filled with the aroma of expensive coffee from the lobby cafe. Thomas was cleaning the restroom on the 3rd floor when he heard Tom Bradshaw's voice echo through the hallway. "Johnson, my office now." Thomas's stomach dropped. He dried his hands quickly and followed his supervisor to the small, windowless office near the loading dock. Bradshaw didn't invite him to sit. "I saw what you did yesterday," Bradshaw said, his arms crossed over his chest. "Sitting outside on company time, giving away your lunch to some bum. You know what that looks like? It looks like we're running a charity here instead of a business. It looks like you don't take your job seriously." Thomas kept his eyes steady. "It was my lunch break, sir. I was off the clock. Your lunch break is 30 minutes. You were gone for 45. I timed it." Bradshaw leaned back in his chair, a thin smile crossing his face. "You're already on probation, Johnson. I've been more than patient with you, but my patience has limits. Consider this your final warning. One more incident, and you're done. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said quietly. "Crystal clear?" He left the office with his jaw clenched, fighting back the anger that threatened to rise in his chest. This job, as demeaning as Bradshaw tried to make it, was everything to him. It had health insurance, which his son desperately needed. It had steady hours, which meant he could pick up his daughter from school every day. It had dignity, despite what people like Bradshaw thought. Thomas had worked hard to get here, to climb out of the hole he'd been in 5 years ago. He wasn't going to let one act of basic human decency cost him everything he'd built. During his afternoon break, Thomas sat in the employee break room, a cramped space in the basement with flickering fluorescent lights and a coffee machine that had been broken for 2 weeks. Sarah Martinez, one of the office assistants, sat down across from him. Unlike most employees, Sarah had always treated Thomas like a human being, remembering his name, asking about his kids. "I heard what Bradshaw said to you," she said quietly, glancing at the door to make sure they were alone. "Elena told me about yesterday, about you sharing your lunch with that man outside." "That was really kind, Thomas." Thomas shrugged, unwrapping the sandwich he'd brought from home. It wasn't anything special. "Guy looked hungry. In this building?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Kindness is revolutionary. Most people here wouldn't notice if someone was dying on the sidewalk as long as it didn't delay their Uber." She paused, her expression turning serious. "But you should be careful. Bradshaw's been looking for a reason to fire you since you started. He doesn't like people who remind him that there's a world outside these walls." Thomas nodded slowly. He'd sensed that from the beginning, the way Bradshaw looked at him, the subtle condescension in every interaction. To men like Bradshaw, janitors weren't really people. They were functions, tools, as replaceable as the mops and buckets they pushed around. That evening, as Thomas prepared to leave, he took one last walk through the executive floor to make sure everything was in order. The sun was setting behind the glass towers of downtown, casting long shadows across the empty offices. He paused at the corner office, the largest one, which had been vacant for months. The nameplate had been removed, but everyone knew it had belonged to Robert Whitmore before his sudden departure. The rumors about what had happened varied wildly. Some said he'd had a nervous breakdown. Others whispered about embezzlement or a secret addiction. All anyone knew for certain was that he'd walked out of a board meeting in August and never came back. Thomas stared at the empty desk. The bare walls where expensive artwork had once hung, and felt a strange sadness. He didn't know Robert Whitmore, had never even seen him before yesterday, if that had indeed been him on those steps. But something about that abandoned office felt profoundly lonely. He didn't see the figure watching him from the darkened conference room across the hall. Robert Whitmore stood in the shadows, his borrowed janitor's uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He'd managed to slip into the building using an old access card that somehow hadn't been deactivated. He'd been living on the streets for 3 months, trying to understand what had gone wrong with his life, with his company, with everything he thought he'd built. And then yesterday, a janitor had shared his lunch with him. No questions asked, no judgment in his eyes. Just simple, uncommon kindness. Robert had spent the night thinking about that moment. Thomas Johnson, a name he'd learned from the ID badge hanging from the man's belt, had given him something more valuable than food. He'd given him a reminder that humanity still existed, even in a world that had become increasingly cold and transactional. The next morning arrived with unexpected chaos. At 9:15 a.m., the executive floor erupted in confused whispers. Robert Whitmore had returned. He'd walked through the lobby doors in a new suit, clean-shaven, his hair cut and styled, looking every bit the executive he'd once been. He'd gone directly to Diana Chen's office in Human Resources, requesting an immediate meeting with her and Mr. Harrison. The current CEO, Elena, watched from her desk as people gathered in clusters, speculating wildly. The prodigal heir had returned, but why? And what did it mean for the company? In Diana Chen's office, Robert sat across from her and Harrison, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "I appreciate you seeing me on short notice," he began. "I know my departure was abrupt and created challenges. I want to explain what happened, and more importantly, I want to discuss the future of this company." Harrison, a cautious man who'd been appointed CEO after Robert's departure, leaned forward. "Robert, we've been trying to reach you for months. Your family has been worried sick." "Where have you been?" "On the streets," Robert said simply, "living as a homeless man. It started as a breakdown, a crisis of identity, but it became something else, an education I desperately needed." He paused, his eyes distant. "I founded this company with my grandfather's legacy, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that legacy was supposed to mean. We became just another corporation, chasing profits, treating people as expendable resources. I needed to remember what it felt like to be on the other side, to be invisible, to be judged as worthless." Diana exchanged a glance with Harrison. This wasn't what they'd expected. "What are you saying, Robert?" "I'm saying I want to return, but not to the company I left. I want to rebuild this place into something better. something that actually values every single person who walks through these doors, from the executives to the janitors. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. I've spent the last 3 months observing this company from the outside. I've watched how we treat our lowest-level employees. I've seen the culture of cruelty and indifference that's taken root. And yesterday, I met a man who reminded me what leadership should actually look like. He opened the folder and placed a photograph on the desk. It was a security camera still from the front steps, showing Thomas Johnson sitting beside him, sharing his lunch. This man, Thomas Johnson, showed me more about the values this company should embody in 20 minutes than I learned in 10 years of board meetings. He didn't know who I was. He just saw another human being in need. Harrison studied the photograph. He's one of our janitors. Exactly, Robert said. And I want to know everything about him. More importantly, I want to understand how we treat our people at every level of this organization. Diana made a quick call to HR records and pulled up Thomas Johnson's file on her computer. As she read through it, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Robert, there's something you should know. Thomas is currently on probation. His supervisor, Tom Bradshaw, filed a complaint yesterday citing the exact incident you're describing. Bradshaw wrote that Johnson was wasting company time and creating a poor image for the company by associating with homeless individuals on company property. The room fell silent. Robert's jaw tightened. Get Bradshaw up here, now. And I want Thomas Johnson here, too. 20 minutes later, Tom Bradshaw stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, confused and slightly annoyed at being summoned. He straightened his tie and approached Diana Chen's office, expecting perhaps a routine facilities update. He was not expecting to see Robert Whitmore sitting behind the desk. Bradshaw's face went pale. Mr. Whitmore, I didn't know you were back. Sit down, Mr. Bradshaw, Robert said coolly. I understand you filed a complaint against one of your employees, Thomas Johnson. Bradshaw shifted uncomfortably. Yes, sir. It was a matter of company policy. Johnson was fraternizing with a vagrant on company property during work hours. It reflects poorly on our image. Tell me, Mr. Bradshaw, what exactly is our image? The question caught Bradshaw off guard. Sir, our company image? What do we stand for? What values do we project to the world? Bradshaw stammered. Well, excellence, efficiency, professionalism. And where does compassion fit into that? Robert interrupted. Where does basic human decency rank in your list of professional values? I don't understand, sir. Robert stood, walking around the desk to face Bradshaw directly. The vagrant Thomas Johnson was fraternizing with, as you put it, was me. I was the homeless man on those steps. And your employee, the one you're trying to punish, showed me more professionalism and humanity in that moment than this entire organization has demonstrated in years. Bradshaw's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The color drained completely from his face. I've been gone for 3 months, Robert continued, his voice hard, and I've learned more about this company from the outside than I ever understood from the inside. I've seen how we treat people like Thomas Johnson, good, hard-working people who keep this building running while executives like you treat them as invisible. That ends today. There was a soft knock at the door. Diana opened it to reveal Thomas Johnson, still in his work uniform, his expression confused and worried. He saw Bradshaw and immediately understood he was in some kind of trouble, though he couldn't imagine what for. Thomas, Robert said, his tone warming immediately. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Thomas remained standing, his cap in his hands. Sir, if this is about yesterday, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything, Robert said gently. I want to thank you. What you did yesterday, sharing your lunch with a stranger, that simple act of kindness, reminded me why I started this company in the first place. It reminded me what real character looks like. Thomas's confusion deepened. He glanced at Bradshaw, whose face had turned a strange shade of red, then back at Robert. I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. Robert smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. The man you shared your lunch with yesterday, that was me. I've been living on the streets for 3 months, trying to understand what went wrong with my life and with this company. You didn't know who I was, you just saw someone who needed help, and you helped. No hesitation, no judgment, just compassion. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Thomas gripped the back of the chair to steady himself. "You're Robert Whitmore," he said slowly, the pieces finally clicking together. "The founder's grandson, the one who disappeared. That's right. And you, Thomas Johnson, without knowing it, taught me the most important lesson I've learned in years. This company has lost its way. We've become so focused on profit margins and efficiency that we've forgotten the human element. We've created a culture where people like Mr. Bradshaw here think it's appropriate to punish employees for showing basic kindness." Bradshaw found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Mr. Whitmore, I was simply enforcing company policy." "A policy I'm changing, effective immediately," Robert cut him off. "Diana, I want a complete review of our employee treatment protocols, starting with facilities and maintenance. I want to know how we compensate our people, how we support them, how we value their contributions. And Mr. Bradshaw, you're relieved of your supervisory duties pending an investigation into your management practices." Bradshaw stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this. I've been with this company for 12 years. I've done everything by the book." "A book I'm rewriting," Robert said firmly. "You're not fired, not yet. But you're going to learn what it means to work without authority, to be treated as just another cog in the machine. Maybe then you'll develop some empathy." After Bradshaw left, escorted by security, Robert turned to Thomas, who still looked shell-shocked. "Thomas, I want to apologize on behalf of this company for how you've been treated. Your personnel file shows you've been an exemplary employee, despite facing numerous personal challenges. You've never missed a day when your presence wasn't absolutely necessary. You've received commendations from multiple departments for going above and beyond. And yet you've been on probation because you showed compassion to someone in need." Thomas finally sat down, his legs suddenly weak. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate this, but I'm just a janitor. I don't need any special treatment. I just need my job." "You're not just anything," Robert said firmly. "And that attitude, that dignity, is exactly why I'm offering you a position on a new task force I'm creating. I need people who understand what it means to work hard, to face real struggles, to maintain integrity, even when no one's watching. I want you to help me rebuild this company's culture from the ground up." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Sir, I don't have any business experience. I clean floors. I empty trash cans. I'm not qualified." "You're more qualified than most of my executives," Robert interrupted, "because you understand something they've forgotten, that every person in this building has value, that dignity isn't determined by your title or your salary. I'm not asking you to become an executive, Thomas. I'm asking you to be a voice for the people who don't usually have one, to help me see the blind spots, the places where we're failing our employees. Will you consider it?" Thomas looked at his hands, calloused and rough from years of manual labor. He thought about his son in the hospital, his daughter who dreamed of going to college someday, his wife who worked 2 jobs to help make ends meet. He thought about all the times he'd been invisible, ignored, dismissed. And he thought about that moment on the steps yesterday when he'd seen a man who needed help and simply helped him, because that's what decent people do. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "But I have one condition." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Name it. I want to keep my regular job too. I don't want to lose touch with why I'm doing this. The other janitors, the maintenance staff, the people in the mailroom, they need to know I'm still one of them, that I haven't forgotten where I came from." A slow smile spread across Robert's face. "Done. You'll work half days in your current position and spend the other half working with my team. And Thomas, your salary will reflect both positions." Over the following weeks, the news of Robert Whitmore's return and the dramatic changes at Whitmore Financial Group spread throughout the company and beyond. Thomas found himself in a strange, new world, splitting his time between cleaning offices and sitting in on meetings with senior leadership. At first, the executives were skeptical, some barely concealing their resentment at having a janitor in their strategy sessions. But Robert had made it clear Thomas's perspective was not optional, it was essential. In one memorable meeting, a VP of operations proposed cutting the night cleaning crew by 30% to reduce costs. We can hire a cheaper contractor service, the VP argued. The current model is unnecessarily expensive. Thomas, sitting at the end of the conference table, raised his hand, hesitantly. Robert nodded at him. The current model employs 43 people directly, Thomas said, his voice steady, despite the intimidating setting. Most of them have been with the company for over 5 years. They have health insurance, retirement plans, and stable schedules. If you switch to a contractor service, those people lose everything, and you'll get workers who are overworked, underpaid, and have no loyalty to this company. Your offices will be dirtier, theft will increase, and you'll save maybe 3% on your operational budget. Is that really worth destroying 43 families? The room fell silent. The VP looked uncomfortable. Robert leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with interest. Thomas raises an excellent point. We've been so focused on the numbers that we've forgotten these decisions affect real people. How many of you even know the names of the people who clean your offices every night? No one answered. The silence was damning. That changes now, Robert declared. We're not just maintaining the cleaning crew, we're expanding benefits. And every executive in this room is going to spend one day working alongside our facilities team. You're going to learn their names, hear their stories, and understand what it takes to keep this building running. The proposal was met with barely concealed horror from some executives, but Robert was unmovable. Over the next month, every senior leader at Whitmore Financial Group spent a day in maintenance uniforms, learning what Thomas and his colleagues dealt with every day. Some executives approached it with grudging curiosity. Others, like Patricia Morrison from legal, found it genuinely eye-opening. She spent her day working with Maria Gonzalez, a single mother of 3 who'd been cleaning offices for 8 years while putting herself through paralegal school at night. I walk past Maria every evening, Patricia said in the next leadership meeting, her voice thick with emotion. For 8 years I've walked past her, and I never once stopped to learn her name or ask about her life. She's been working toward a career in law, my field, and I never knew. That's on me. That's on all of us. The culture shift wasn't smooth or easy. There were executives who resisted, who saw Robert's reforms as naive and financially irresponsible. 2 VPs resigned rather than adapt to the new expectations. But slowly, gradually, something fundamental began to change. The invisible people became visible. The custodial staff started receiving thank you notes. The cafeteria workers found that executives now asked about their weekends. Small gestures, but they mattered. Thomas became an unexpected leader in this transformation. His quiet dignity and practical wisdom earned respect even from those who'd initially dismissed him. He started a mentorship program pairing executives with entry-level employees, created an anonymous feedback system that actually listened to frontline workers, and pushed for policies that recognized life happened outside work hours, that people had families and responsibilities and deserved respect. 3 months after Robert's return, Sarah Martinez knocked on Thomas's new office door, a small space near his old maintenance closet that he'd insisted on keeping. "Thomas, you've got a visitor." The man who entered was in his early 60s, well-dressed, but with a humble bearing. "Mr. Johnson? I'm Richard Whitmore, Robert's father. I wanted to meet the man who brought my son back to us." Thomas stood quickly, wiping his hands on his pants. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, I didn't do anything special." "You did everything," Richard interrupted gently. "My son was lost, not just physically but spiritually. He'd forgotten why his grandfather started this company in the first place. Old Henry Whitmore grew up poor, worked as a clerk, and built this firm on the principle that business should elevate everyone it touches, not just the people at the top. Somewhere over the years, we lost that vision. You helped Robert find it again." Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed a young man in a simple suit standing in front of a modest office building. "That's my father, Henry. On the day he opened Whitmore Financial Group in 1952, he started with 3 employees and a mission to help ordinary people build better lives." Robert used to carry a copy of this photo everywhere, but he stopped years ago, said it felt old-fashioned, sentimental. "Yesterday, I saw him hang it back up in his office." Thomas looked at the photo, at the determined hope in Henry Whitmore's young eyes, and felt a connection across the decades to a man he'd never met. "Your father understood something important," Thomas said quietly. "That success isn't just about what you build, it's about who you become in the process." Richard smiled, his eyes glistening. "My father would have liked you very much, Mr. Johnson." That evening, as Thomas prepared to begin his cleaning rounds, Robert found him in the supply room. "I wanted you to hear this from me first," Robert said. "The board met today. They've approved a comprehensive reform package. Living wages for all employees, expanded health care, paid family leave, and a profit-sharing program that includes everyone from the mailroom to the executive suite. It's going to cost us significantly in the short term, but I believe it will make us stronger in the long run." Thomas felt emotion rising in his chest. "How did you convince them?" Robert laughed. "I showed them the numbers. Employee turnover is down 40% since we started treating people with dignity. Productivity is up. Client satisfaction is at an all-time high because happy employees provide better service. But more than that, I told them about you, about what happened on those steps. I reminded them that we're in the business of trust, and how can clients trust us with their financial futures if we don't even trust or value our own people?" He paused, his expression becoming serious. "Thomas, I need you to know something. What you did that day, it didn't just help me, it saved me. I was ready to disappear completely, to give up on everything I'd built. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that human connection still matters. You gave me a reason to come back and fight for something better." Thomas met his eyes. "I gave you half a sandwich, Mr. Whitmore. You did all the rest yourself." "You gave me hope," Robert corrected. "And hope, it turns out, is worth more than any asset on our balance sheet." 6 months after that cold November morning, Whitmore Financial Group held its annual company meeting. For the first time, every employee was invited, from the newest mail clerk to the CEO. The event was held not in a fancy hotel, but in the company's own renovated cafeteria, which had been transformed into a bright, welcoming space with windows overlooking the city. Robert stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of nearly 400 employees. Thomas sat in the front row, still uncomfortable with the attention, but present because Robert had insisted. "I want to tell you all a story," Robert began. 6 months ago, I was sitting on the steps outside this building, lost and alone. I'd given up on myself, on this company, on everything I thought I was building. And then a man sat down next to me and shared his lunch. He didn't know who I was. He just knew I was hungry. The room was utterly silent. Everyone had heard various versions of this story by now, but hearing it directly from Robert carried a different weight. That man, Thomas Johnson, reminded me what my grandfather knew when he founded this company 70 years ago. That business is fundamentally about people. Not profit, not efficiency, not shareholder value. People, the real ones, with families and struggles and dreams. The ones we see every day, but somehow manage to overlook. He gestured to Thomas, who shifted uncomfortably. Thomas is now our Director of Employee Experience, but he still spends his mornings working alongside our facilities team because he refuses to forget where he came from. He's helped us rebuild this company from the inside out, and I'm proud to announce that under his guidance, we've been recognized by the Better Business Alliance as one of the top employers in the state for workplace dignity and employee satisfaction. Applause erupted throughout the room. Sarah whistled loudly. Elena wiped tears from her eyes. Thomas felt his face grow hot, but he couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. His wife squeezed his hand from the seat beside him, pride evident in her eyes. His kids, sitting behind him, were beaming. Robert continued, "But this isn't just about one person or one act of kindness. It's about all of us choosing every single day to see each other as human beings worthy of respect. It's about building a company where everyone, regardless of their title or position, knows they matter. Where kindness isn't punished, it's celebrated. Where success is measured not just by our profits, but by the positive impact we have on people's lives." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather used to say that a company's true wealth isn't in its bank accounts, it's in the character of its people. I forgot that for a long time. But I remember now, thanks to a janitor who saw a stranger in need and simply helped. That's the culture we're building here. That's who we are." As the meeting concluded and people began mingling, Tom Bradshaw approached Thomas cautiously. He'd been working as a junior facilities coordinator for the past few months, learning humility the hard way. "Johnson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you." "About a lot of things." Thomas studied him for a moment. Bradshaw looked different, less arrogant, more worn down, but in a way that seemed almost healthy, like a rough edge being smoothed. "We all have things to learn," Thomas said finally. "The question is whether we're willing to learn them." Bradshaw nodded slowly. "I'm trying. It's harder than I thought, being on the other side. But I'm trying. That's all any of us can do," Thomas said, extending his hand. Bradshaw shook it, and something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding born from shared struggle. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Robert and Thomas stood together looking out the window at the city lights. "You know what's interesting?" Robert mused. "6 months ago I thought I'd lost everything. Turns out I had to lose everything to find what actually mattered." Thomas nodded. "Sometimes we need to be broken down before we can be built back up right." "Is that from experience?" Thomas smiled softly. "I told you I understood what it felt like to have nothing. 5 years ago I was where you were. Lost my job, lost my house, nearly lost my family. Ended up living in my car for 2 months with my wife and kids. It was a church volunteer who helped me, gave me a meal, and information about a job training program. No judgment, just help. I swore then that if I ever got back on my feet, I'd do the same for others. That's why I gave you half my sandwich. Because someone once gave me a chance when I had nothing." Robert turned to him, surprised. "I never knew. Most people don't. They see the uniform and assume that's all there is to see. But everyone's got a story, Mr. Whitmore. Everyone's fighting battles we can't see. That's why kindness matters so much, why it changes everything." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Thomas, for the sandwich, for the lesson, for helping me rebuild this place into something my grandfather would be proud of, for reminding me what actually matters." "Thank you for listening," Thomas replied. "Most people in your position wouldn't have. They'd have gone back to their comfortable life and forgotten all about the homeless guy on the steps. You chose to remember. You chose to change. That took more courage than anything I did." As they stood there, two men from vastly different worlds brought together by a simple act of compassion, the city continued its endless rhythm below them. Somewhere out there, other people were struggling. Other acts of kindness were unfolding. Other lives were being quietly transformed by someone choosing to see another person's humanity. The story of the janitor who shared his lunch with a homeless man, only for that man to walk into HR the next day and change everything, became something of a legend at Whitmore Financial Group. New employees heard it during orientation. It was referenced in strategy meetings and used as a touchstone for decision-making. But more than a story, it became a living philosophy embedded in the company's DNA. Thomas continued to split his time between his two roles, never forgetting where he came from, always advocating for those who had no voice. Robert rebuilt the company into something that honored his grandfather's original vision while adapting to modern realities. And every November, on the anniversary of that cold day, when two strangers shared a meal on concrete steps, the entire company participated in a day of service, going out into the community to help those in need. Because they'd all learned what Thomas had always known, that kindness isn't weakness, compassion isn't naive, and seeing someone's humanity costs nothing but changes everything. In a world that often feels cold and transactional, that simple truth became revolutionary. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you to see the people around you, to recognize that everyone has value regardless of their position or circumstances, then share it. Subscribe to hear more stories about real human connection, about courage and compassion, about the small acts that create big change. Hit that like button if you believe that kindness matters, that dignity is universal, and that how we treat each other defines who we are. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to make it through this complicated world, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to share their lunch to remind us of that fundamental truth.